EU says they're prepared to back security guarantees for Ukraine in the event of a peace deal. But are we not even close to a peace deal? And more troubling, is the EU not even capable of providing the Ukrainians with the security they need, especially in the face of a Russian army that is modern and massive? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Hit subscribe and let's get into it. So, unfortunately, you may have noticed that despite being almost apparently in the pocket almost of Russia, or at least certainly apathetic at best to Ukraine and European security, President Trump still needs to be courted by the EU. And in fact, French President Macron has said that, well, the U.S. role in security guarantees for Ukraine will be decided in the coming weeks. Now, those of you that follow the war may note that Putin has said he's not going to accept or recognize any kind of security guarantee for Ukraine. In fact, he's said there will be no foreign troops of any kind in Ukraine, which is a weird thing to say about a country that, again, Russia says they have no interest in conquering. But the stranger part is that you may say to yourself, guys, France is a large, modern industrial economy, an economy that's several times the size of Russia. So why is he finding himself having to beg Trump and the U.S. for a security guarantee, right? Now, Zelensky says that Germany, Italy, and Poland are among Ukraine's potential security guarantors. He said, we won't go into detail yet, but we already have an understanding of cooperation, right? Now, if you don't know anything about politics, and particularly international politics, things like an understanding, a framework, these things are code for absolute fluff, meaningless documents. And sometimes these meaningless documents can have value, as we point out, for example, the Russia-Chinese cooperation agreements, which are sort of fluff, but there's also evidence, though, that they are backed by real action. And that's where things get a little light. Because you see, these countries, Germany, Italy, and Poland, they don't actually have militaries large enough to actually take on the Russian military. And again, this is really putting the cart before the horse, because U.S. and Europe, they say, oh, we're going to impose additional sanctions on Russia if it continues to refuse participation in the peace process. But again, the U.S. president hasn't really said anything about that. And Macron is saying we are sending a clear message, right? A clear message is another politician speak for fluff, meaningless documents. Clear message now that all signals must be turned into reality. We have always been on the side of the law and defended a just peace. There can be no reward for aggression because it's a prelude to further wars. This is, of course, he's referring, of course, to the fact that Russia has signed multiple ceasefires and other agreements which guaranteed Ukrainian sovereignty going back to the late 90s when they signed the Budapest Memorandum that guarantees Ukrainian sovereignty. And then just a few years later, Putin annexed the Crimea and Donbas, and then ended that fighting with not one but two separate Minsk Accords that Russia immediately went and violated. And so when he says that a reward for aggression is a prelude to further wars, that's what he's referring to, right? That Vladimir Putin has a real robust track record of continuing to invade countries after signing peace agreements with them. And so there's a problem, though, and that is that the Europeans, well, they're sort of struggling to actually, provide that security guarantee, because a piece of paper from France that says we won't let this happen isn't the same thing as not letting something happen, right? It's a little bit like saying, it's the difference between saying, if you steal a package from Amazon, you'll get arrested. Well, or if you steal a package off of someone's porch, you'll get arrested. You can say that, but you actually have to arrest some people to get, porch pirates to stop. And the problem is that, well, Europe doesn't really have the capacity to put up an actual security guarantee, at least not without what they call American backstopping, right? Now, the French are saying we're ready and willing and able to provide somebody, and that the plans have the support of the U.S. But, well, you know, the Europeans say they have a blueprint at a technical level. But it's still like other sources are saying this is just not the case, right? The Europeans even have to admit the package hinges on U.S. involvement in logistics, air and missile defense, and intelligence sharing, which is basically everything but infantry, right? So Europe can provide warm bodies if the U.S. does literally everything else, okay? Right? And some European capitals said they won't even sign on unless clarity on these points, which is code for unless the U.S. promises to backstop us, right? And the fact is that this is all of this is cart before the horse. One European diplomat told the Kiev Independent that the momentum in the talks has faded. Russia is preparing fresh attacks on Ukrainian territory, and a Putin-Zelensky summit is nowhere in sight. Sending in a peacekeeping force after a truce is a key concern of most of the leaders, right? Which, of course, some are saying we'll send actual peacekeepers, some won't, and some aren't even sure, right? They also say, oh, well, we've got to prevent spreading our resources too thin, for example, pulling resources away from the Baltic states. German defense minister has said this talk is premature, that the EU's executive has no mandate or competency whatsoever when it comes to positioning troops, which is yikes. That's a pretty brutal shots fired. All this to say, guys, the problem is that the Europeans admit that well, it's a nice fantasy. Yeah, we'd all love to live in a world where there's a peace deal and that European peacekeepers separate the Russians from the Ukrainians. But, well, the Russians are ramping up attacks on Kiev. The Russians are refusing to meet with Zelensky, who, by the way, has said, we'll meet Putin anywhere, anytime. Wherever you want, dude, we'll meet. No conditions. Russia has said, well, Putin can't meet with Zelensky because Zelensky's not legitimate, but we would meet with him if Ukrainian troops withdrew from their prepared defensive positions, and then the Ukrainian armed forces scaled down, and they have to recognize our control of Luhansk before we even meet as a precondition to meeting. Russia has all these stupid games, right? And the fact is that the Europeans are just continuing to do what they always do, which is talk and provide nonsense documents. And, you know, literally, this is a fantasy. This is the European equivalent of saying, how would you survive a zombie apocalypse? Well, I'd build a fucking airship and I'd sail off in a fucking boat with a farm on top, right? Like that's how realistic they're being right now. Because the reality, today's reality on the ground, is that Russian troops are advancing. The Russian economy is totally, fully militarized, showing no signs of stopping. And the Europeans themselves admit that the only way this whole fantasy works is if the U.S. literally provides everything that isn't cannon fodder. Like everything that a real military has to do, like logistics and supplies and air defense and intelligence, the U.S. has to take the lead on, which is insane. Like so basically the Europeans are like, all we have are individual infantry troops, something that, by the way, the Ukrainians produce by the thousands with 2 weeks of training. Like, what is this reassurance for us? What exactly is this guarantee if the Europeans themselves are signaling? By the way, the Russians read this. The Russians are saying, listen, the Europeans admit they can't do air defense. They don't have any intelligence. They don't have any logistics. They don't have the capacity to do anything. So if you're Vladimir Putin, you're like, yeah, dude, I'm going to blackmail all of Europe. I'm going to roll over Ukraine, and then I'm going to knock on the Baltics and say, guess what? You withdraw from NATO or I invade. And I know you won't do anything because the U.S. won't step in, and you are you don't have the logistics. You don't have the equipment. You don't have any of the essentials to actually fight and win against us. And what choice will they have, right? What choice will the Baltics have? Nothing. And the thing that's frustrating is the U.S. recalcitrance in this, because you may recall that they coerced Ukraine to sign away its natural resources to the U.S. in exchange for, well, they said U.S. support. In fact, the U.S. said it was just as good as a security guarantee. But you notice that the U.S. is still moving forward with this deal. We're still going to squeeze the Ukrainians for all their minerals. But what do we provide them? not weapons, because we make the Europeans buy the weapons. All we've done is kind of fuck them, right? But we're still trying to get all this stuff out of them, right? The value of new U.S. military assistance could be considered as nominal capital to the fund if Washington chooses to do so. But there is no new U.S. military assistance. It's military assistance provided by the EU, purchased from the United States. And the reason I want to point all this out, the reason my big gripe with this is right here. Look, this is the difference. The difference is that North Korea, right, a pariah state, an economy a fraction of the size of even the smallest EU countries. But the difference is the North Koreans were happy, easily sent real combat troops into the fight. And so this is sort of the difficulty here, is that the EU is big, they have big economies, they have robust populations, but what they don't have is the ability to act decisively against a threat. And you contrast this. The fact that North Korea is better able to provide really meaningful, robust logistics and military support in the form of real on-the-ground combat troops to Russia, while the EU signs memorandums, talks about frameworks, does everything but the hard stuff. And then you look at a dictator, a human rights abuser, and somehow these guys, the two worst people on the fucking global stage, are better friends, are better at mutual support than a whole collection of democracies. It's absurd. It is a farce. And it is probably the largest single fault line that this war has exposed in the West. Guys, if you appreciate my content and you want to support me and keep me independent, you can do so by subscribing at combatvetnews.com. This is functionally my Patreon or my Substack, where twice a week we drop uncensored combat videos as well as Q&As for members. A huge thank you to our Colonel tier members, guys like Henry Russier, Ida Sky, Chris Rossi, AL90, Sergey Zinchenko, D. Stewart, and all of our Lieutenant tier members. We couldn't do it without you guys. Thanks so much. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.